welcome everybody. As you will have noticed, I am not Marloes Reining. My name is Milan Master, and I'll be your host for today's Regenerative Collaborative webinar. And our topic today will be strategies for biodiversities. And today's webinar is sponsored by the South African Institute of Drafting. They have graciously given us sponsorship for this month's webinar as well as next month. So we're really and truly grateful. Lizette will be posting some of the links in the chat as well, so please go ahead and follow them. Just a little background, the South African Institute of Drafting is an independent professional body which was established in South Africa in 1953. The Institute strives to serve its members, interacting with all role players and associated industries, being mindful and conscious of necessary changes in the environment to fulfill its vision. An objective of the Institute is to promote all the interests of all its members in all professions within the built environment. And I think that's exactly what they're doing by helping us and sponsoring this webinar. So a big thank you to Syed for their contribution this month. And then just some background is that we've done a lot of these webinars already. And if you go to GreenEd, you'll be able to retake these webinars and also get some CPD points as well. This year already, this is our 7th webinar for the year, so please keep a lookout for the others. And again, go to GreenEd if you would like to revisit any of these topics. Cool. And the Regenerative Collaborative South Africa is a volunteer organization. So if you have any skills in organizing events, advocacy, or want to join us for social media, please feel free to reach out to us, follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn for more updates on future webinars, and if you'd like to get in touch with us. And we're also running a competition. We're constantly looking out for any interesting topics or potential speakers or sponsors. So if you know of any topics or speakers, please feel free to let us know, and you could possibly win 500 Rand. Cool. So once again, today's topic will be on the strategies for biodiversities. Our first speaker will be Dr. Peta Brom. Dr. Brom has nearly 20 years experience in the green building industry. After cutting her teeth in industry and pioneering organizations such as PJ Carew Consulting, she returned to study and reskill herself in urban ecology and concluded a PhD in 2021. Since then, she has made steady contributions to her research agenda on realizing multifunctional ecosystem benefits for green infrastructure. She's currently working for Ecolution Consulting as a senior sustainability consultant, and is the head of certification in her role and certifications operations manager, and also my fellow colleague. So really looking forward to her. And after that, she'll be followed by Prof. Francois Cilliers, who represents a citizen scientist collective known as the Wildflower Stepping Stone Project. The project practices community stewardship aimed at restoring and conserving critical endangered locally indigenous vegetation in urban areas. Committed to the urban environmental conversation, Prof. Cilliers and his team have embarked on a remarkable journey to protect and restore Renosterveld, a distinctive part of the Cape Flora Kingdom that is under threat due to urbanization and human activities. And on that note, I'll hand over to Peter.
Good afternoon, everybody. I will turn my camera on. I'm going to ask that we all quickly, I put the Mentimeter link at the beginning of the session into the chat. And I'm going to ask that everybody please just take a moment to go and fill this in, if you don't mind. It really should only take you a few seconds, and we should be able to see the results updating live. So if I can ask everyone to do this little exercise to warm us up. And then I'll be able to start the rest of the presentation. Yay, something's happening. I was getting nervous there. See, things are stabilizing. See if there are any outliers that throw things into a wildly different space. We've still got another 12, 13 people we're waiting for to vote. Okay, I think we get the idea that there is a drop-off in what is happening. I will start showing you my presentation now. There we go. So as you saw there was a drop-off in the Mentimeter in people's experience of nature in their own environments. And this phenomenon is associated with urbanization and it is called The Extinction of Experience. And if we take a look, so if we have a look at what's happening across the continent in Africa, and in fact, within the context of global urbanization, we are urbanizing faster than anywhere else in the world, especially in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. And this renders a particular set of sustainable urbanism challenges, which we now have to kind of look at within the context of where we were in the early 2000s, where the rhetoric of sustainable urban development targeted the fact that South African cities were characterized by low density dormitory suburbs and urban sprawl, and that this decreased the efficiency of our urban infrastructure, it reduced the viability of public transport, and it increased our reliance on private vehicle use, which within the kind of carbon agenda is a problem that we jumped on hands on. It was also densification, the counter to this, was also seen as a way of protecting biodiversity outside of the city and as a balance, as a way of ensuring that we could conserve more natural areas. And the ways in which we approached this were through consolidation, infill development, and a controlled urban edge. Consolidation is the replacement of single-story buildings with multi-story buildings, or putting together plots to get greater coverage. Infill development, is when you take vacant plots or pieces of open land within the city and you start developing those. And the controlled urban edge is not approving urban development outside a particular boundary of the city for the urban edge. So this mandate of densification has been happening ongoing for the last 2 decades, if not longer, without any consideration for the fact that it leads to a loss of both public and private green infrastructure. And let me just define quickly what green infrastructure is, what I understand by it, and what I'm talking about, so that we're all on the same page. It is a strategically planned network of natural and semi-natural areas within other environmental features designed and managed to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services. So it's not just your green space or your green wall, but the consideration of what the function of that is in terms of the ecosystem, as well as how it connects with other pieces of green space and urban green infrastructure throughout the city. So this is important because the health consequences of loss of green space, of loss of access to green space, is that children growing up with access to natural areas have lower incidences of psychiatric disorders in adulthood. The literature on this, the number of studies that can support this are so many that I'm not even going to bother to reference it, because I could fill pages and pages with pieces of literature that support this. It's really well established. And secondly, neighborhoods with lower percentages of green space have increased levels of cardiovascular disease. That's from a systematic literature review that was undertaken in 2016. So they looked at it exhaustively. And specifically, Gascon was looking at mortality statistics. And he showed unequivocally that making use of outdoor green space lowered heart cardiovascular disease. Then thirdly, we all know in this industry about the urban heat island effect and the loss of flood absorption capacity. It's very well entrenched in the green building standards. To improve that by increasing the absorption of water, by reducing your permeable landscapes, by using sustainable urban drainage systems. But what is not particularly well kind of taken from our literature, from science into practice, is the understanding that what reduces urban warming is the combination of moisture in the soil, evapotranspiration, that's actually having good vegetation in the surroundings, not just open grass, and shade. So those three things work together to cool our cities. And then the health annual cost of loss of connection with nature is projected to be 7 trillion globally by 2030, which is quite a staggering amount of money. And that's on an annual basis. Currently, I'm working with this sort of theoretical framework of understanding and unpacking the different functions of urban green infrastructure. We have biodiversity, and I'm seeing it as a nested system. Biodiversity really underpins ecosystem health, climate resilience, and human well-being. And these functions that I have arranged around this, I will unpack a little bit in the following slides. But it aligns very clearly with the Sustainable Development Goals, and that our conceptualization of the Sustainable Development Goals is supported by the biosphere and by biosphere health. So the multifunctional components of green infrastructure, from a human perspective, it's psychological well-being, recreation and exercise, spiritual connection, social connection, and education. These are all functions that are fulfilled by having access to green space on a daily basis. Then, of course, where I already spoke about flood absorption and urban heat island effect and the cooling effect of vegetation, no news there. But in Africa, in our context specifically, it is also there's the provisioning ecosystem services that people get access to through medicine, food, livestock grazing, and biofuel. And research from Charlie Shackleton's lab at Rhodes University has shown that this can supplement people's livelihoods by up to 30% of their household income. So having access to good quality urban green space or being or natural areas that have these burgeoning ecosystem services can really be a poverty alleviation strategy for cities and for the urban poor as well. So then the question that comes up is, as designers thinking about urban ecology and urban biodiversity, recognizing the importance of it, what kind of biodiversity can we really seek to support in the city? What can we design for? What does it make sense to design for? Noting that there's also potentially likely to be conflict that arises. And the most obvious nature that we find in the city are these guys, the urban exploiters. Now, we don't need to design for them. Our buildings, our food structures, the way we move through the city, everything we do supports them, and that's why they become pests, because they are able to take advantage of the conditions that we create in cities, and it works for them. This group, sensitive, we call them urban avoiders. We're unlikely. I mean, I always say when I present this slide that if I say you won't find them in the city, somebody is going to tell me about the impala that is on the CSIR's grounds, or the zebra on the edge of the mountain in Cape Town. So I say we're unlikely to be able to support them in our integrated green infrastructure. And this is why we need conservation. But there's this very big group of urban adapters that sit on a continuum between those that exploit the opportunities within the city and those that avoid the city or really just respond badly to the stresses and can't handle it and can't thrive in the city. And this we call urban adapters. And we call them adapters because they are able to make use of artificial structures. They're able to make use of the resources that we provide in our gardens. They're able to move through the city. They might adjust the time of day when they're most active so that they avoid conflict with people. And what we can do is figure out how to make cities more friendly or more conducive to supporting them so that they come into contact with stresses and conflict less frequently, and that people are aware that they're there and are able to appreciate them. So those are the kind of objectives that we're looking for when we're thinking about designing for nature with biodiversity in mind. So bearing that in mind, I've identified some key strategies for green buildings and for green infrastructure. and for planning it. The first is to build stepping stone habitats and corridors. So this study from 2018 is a global synthesis, found that small isolated patches of biodiversity, of conservation areas, are inordinately important for biodiversity and conservation. They punch well above their weight. So our traditional notions of conservation has been that the bigger a patch is, the more intact it is, the better able to support biodiversity it is. And this doesn't dispel that or dispute it at all, because the most sensitive species will definitely need much more space. But our smaller pieces of conservation areas, and it's been measured by urban ecologists that the threshold for good biodiversity in a city are patches of around 50 hectares, which is bigger than an urban park, but that doesn't mean that urban parks are not important. When I say urban park, sorry, pocket park, but that doesn't mean that our smaller pocket parks and road verges are also not important. So we need to start thinking about corridors and larger patches or islands within the urban matrix, and then identify stepping stones which can be used for bolstering mobility, for gene dispersion, and for connecting the larger patches. So what we're looking to do is for especially more mobile species, like your smaller birds and your insects, who can fly to identify patches that they can move between, where they can rest and refuel between getting to the bigger, safer, more conducive pieces of habitat. So what this might look like is that brownfield or developed sites can make use of locally indigenous plants, and locally indigenous plants would refer to the South African vegetation map. In Cape Town alone, there are 19 different vegetation types or ecosystems. So this is not just proteas. If you are in Renosterveld, the dominant species you should be looking at are Eriocephalus, wild rosemary, wild salvias, and pelargoniums. If you're in Strandveld, then we're looking at different species that are more bushy and bigger. As I've just drawn a total blank on the species list that I had in my head. You can look it up, but that's the point, is let's refer to this vegetation map, and as far as is possible, try to match the historical vegetation to pull out the dominant species and celebrate them in our landscaping choices and our landscaping palettes. Then the second item that I had on the bullet point is you can match your habitat structure of nearby green space. So for example, if you have a whole bunch of patches of tree canopy, then you can plant a copse of trees that creates a stepping stone through the tree canopy that you can identify on either side of you. Similarly, if there's shrubland, you might want to think about planting some similar heath or shrubland on your site to create that stepping stone or connection within the landscape. So then for undeveloped or greenfield sites, we have a different set of strategies in mind, and that might be a propagation nursery from rescued plants. So before you go and you grade, you go and you rescue plant material. Now, when we start talking about fynbos, the moment you touch any of the fynbos species roots, they die. So we have a much better chance of rescuing species if we take cuttings from them and we set up a nursery where we're able to transplant seedlings or smaller plants that have been grown from cuttings into the ground without disturbing their root systems. And the second option is to rehabilitate degraded areas, especially if you can set aside areas on your site that can receive this treatment. Then the third opportunity is to stimulate the seed bank. And we have for 10 years on our green buildings been storing up topsoil, and you store up this topsoil and you protect it. And then at the end of the project, when we return it back, we all say goodbye and we hand it over to the landscapers, and the landscaping and maintenance team comes through and weeds out everything that was not planted. So I've often thought that there's amazing opportunity in this process to smoke treat or burn that stockpiled soil just before, especially in the fire-driven ecosystems specifically, before it is returned to site, and then have an ecologist visit the site regularly over the course of the following year to identify the species of plant that emerge in the landscape and do training with the landscaping staff so that they can identify them and know the difference between a critically endangered species that happen to have had seed in the topsoil versus a weed that is just coming up. And it will vary from site to site, the extent to which this is an opportunity, but specifically on areas that may have also had may have been identified for search and rescue and for conservation or conservation offsets, then this is a really great opportunity. The retention of wild and unmanaged or strategically managed areas. I show this picture here. This is a park in Aarhus in Denmark. And what they've done with this site is, this is a little bit of a urban reconciliation, rewilding project. But they have these berms and they mow up to a point to create the sense of a bed. And what this does is it allows us to have those wild areas, but it because it looks intentional and is maintained as being intentional, it really helps people to accept that wild and unkempt feeling of those areas. So on all sites, there's a need for including cues to care. Now, in the urban ecology literature, it's called cues to care, but I think of it like from an architectural perspective as just good old-fashioned landscape legibility. Being able to have wayfinding and pathways and signage and clearly defined spaces. And they say that this helps people to see and to read in the landscape that it is cared for, even though it's a wild landscape or it's a rewilded landscape. And so for all those people who say it looks untidy, and it's potentially depreciating the value of my property if we don't mow, if we allow it to become wild and bushy, that dispels that notion because we can see that it is cared for. So the second strategy is to provide for the full life cycle of needs. And this is what I call animal-aided design. And I've got another presentation that I'm going to open up after this and just give you a little bit more detail so you can have a little bit more of the kind of hard skills of this before we go, and some tools. So that means thinking about the juvenile phase, the adult phase, foraging opportunities, knowing whether or not an animal is going to hibernate or estivate, and thinking about what its dietary needs are, and ensuring that all of those needs and phases in the life cycle are catered for on your site and in your design, and including features in your project that attend to those. So the example that is given by the guys who coined the term animal-aided design is this one of house sparrows. Remember, I'm speaking to urban adapters, and house sparrows are the quintessential urban adapter. They're even called house sparrows because they're around people's homes. And this included putting bird boxes or have in the facade of the building and designing for birds or for any creature of flight. They will always take the minimum size hole. If you want to design for sparrows, you choose a smaller hole that only a sparrow can fit through. If you want to design for owls, the entrance has to be much bigger because an owl is much bigger. And house sparrows like to take dust baths. We know we've seen guinea fowl do that quite a lot as well. So if you're designing with guinea fowl in mind, which might be another target species you can look at, then what the designers or the architects who wrote the paper suggested is that you actually put around the base of the tree little kind of sandy patches that can be used with loose, suitable dust bath soil in it by the birds. And then, of course, foraging opportunities for insects and nesting material and little seeds and things in a wild grasses. And specifically for house sparrows, all of this needs to be within about 50 meters distance from the nesting boxes. Everything needs to be provided for them to use it. And then the other really nice example that I like to look at is for frogs. And actually at the pond, you'll find that dragonfly needs are quite similar to frogs. And so because we've all got these sustainable urban drainage systems that we're now bringing into our green buildings, there's such a fabulous opportunity to include landscaping and landscape design with amphibians in mind, because the water in the breeding pond is there. And at the breeding pond, all that is really needed is a shallow zone with emerging vegetation. And the other thing that happens is the moment you do that, you get your dragonflies and your pond skates. So your mosquito infestation lasts about 2 months. And then after that, all the predators that eat them come and you no longer have a mosquito problem at that pond. They like to refuge in burrows. A lot of species of amphibians estivate, which is to hibernate during the dry season in the ground. That's why we don't see them during summer. They need dense undergrowth. In fact, all creeping animals, herp species, herpetofauna, called creeping because they go through the dense undergrowth. They're often quite heat sensitive and they'll dry out if they have to get exposed to the sun for too long. And then the frogs specifically find food in amongst dead leaves and rock piles and wood piles. So we need to start bringing that into it. Interestingly enough, if you are designing for pollinating Diptera, having rotting wood is required for the juvenile stage of their development. That's what they use. So then thirdly, reduce barriers to movement. And this can be really simple, to starting with something like having a palisade fence rather than a wall. Many creatures can find cracks and chinks in a wall, but there's much less exposure if they can get free movement through. And especially if you mix that with a hedge, then you've got both support of the ability to move through the boundary as well as a place to hide from predators. And then, of course, a continuous tree canopy would be necessary for owls and for squirrels. So thinking about how animals move around, in our version 2 of Green Star, which is being launched at the moment or being developed, this comes up. And another way to remove barriers to movement is to have underpasses. And here you can build a specialized underpass, or you can use some of the existing technology in our stormwater systems. This is a penguin underpass from New Zealand. And here is an example from Christmas Island of a crab bridge, where they've got the barriers, little barriers up that funnel the red crab migration onto the bridge. And then this is just mantis grating that they've got that goes over the top of the bridge, and then all the crabs can cross the road safely. And in Cape Town, we've now got our own western leopard toad crossing in an underpass with just this little concrete shape they go under. So we're busy testing our first ones. I'm claiming it. It's not actually my project at all. I would love for it to have been something I was involved in, but we'll see how this progresses, how well it gets used, and hopefully it will save some western leopard toad lives. I touched on it earlier on, speaking about soil sealing. Soil sealing is one of the most studied kind of biodiversity drivers internationally. And as the percentage of soil sealing increases in the urban environment, there are certain species that disappear from the species pool. So the less soil sealing we have, the better it is for biodiversity. Never mind the stormwater implications of it. We just need to stop paving, guys. So here you'll see, with an increase in in soil sealing, there's a turnover in species towards being generalist with above ground nesting and foraging needs. And all of these species here are found along the urbanization gradient, but disappear from the most urbanized parts of the city. The grumpy frog there, the rain frog, is near threatened, sometimes or vulnerable. So there's different species. Some of them are vulnerable, some of them are near threatened. And I think if we were to reduce our soil sealing, they would have a much greater chance of survival because they live in burrows under the ground. So a little bit of inspiration. This is a caracal that was seen in Newlands, in the lower part of Newlands, quite close to the freeway. And we're seeing, the more people become aware of these creatures in their surrounding, the more amazing it is to see them, of course. Yeah, so we see people reporting on it, and it's been really great to see the Urban Caracal Project documenting these and the results of how that has come into our environment. I'm going to quickly show you one or two slides from my animal-aided design lecture that I do with third years. What I wanted to show you first off is that, so this is more of a how-to. So I view animal-aided design as being supplementary to the design process. When I'm speaking to third-year ecology students, I do a summary of what the design process looks like. I will not do that for you guys because I think you know it. And then the first thing is to start by understanding what is currently present. So I think the big question is, what target species should we be thinking about? And that's one of the things I wanted to leave with you when we start thinking about animal-aided design, is designing features with a particular species in mind. It's not just about going, let's do balding eagles. No, wrong continent. It's about figuring out what is broadly kind of there that can be supported better. So what tools do we have available for that? So, first off, you can get full-on biological sciences or hire an ecologist and do a species survey, maybe in a nearby natural area or maybe on your site to see what's there. You would employ things like traps, maybe camera traps. You might do some sweep netting or have some reptile pitfall traps, and you'd have a sampling kind of pattern to figure out what's there. This is probably the most extensive and labor-intensive way of tackling this question. I like to start with a desktop study from iNaturalist. So iNaturalist crowdsourced data is an amazing part of the fourth industrial revolution that I'm very excited about. You can use this piece of code to set up a bounding box, and then with a circle around your GPS coordinate that you've chosen where your site is. And then you can filter what it returns to you. Here, for example, I've filtered categories for birds, amphibians, snakes and reptiles, small mammals, and plants. But it's probably not necessary to do that, especially if you can see how many returns you have here. It's a lot of information to filter through. But in this particular site, we discovered that there were Cape dwarf chameleons in the area, and that becomes quite a nice charismatic species to start thinking about designing for. So that's a nice place to kind of look for species that are sort of broadly within your area. This is set to 1 kilometer. Then the second sort of set of things that you might want to look at, obviously the vegetation map, which I made reference to from Sambi earlier on. That will give you an indication of the historic ecosystem, and you'll be able to go and research what historically might have occurred in the area in that particular habitat. And so that can give you another indication. Your conservation and biodiversity plans, which are being developed by most municipalities nationally, sometimes go and do, specifically Gauteng's C plan has done quarter-degree grid ground truthing. So when you go into GIS and into their attribute tables, you can find notes there on what species might have been or what species they observed in those habitats. So that's quite a nice tool for giving you an idea of thinking about what we're hoping to conserve or what we might have observed in the area and what you can start to plan for and design for. This is another very cool tool called Cape Farm Mapper. It has cadastrals and earth diagrams on it as well. So that's particularly helpful in figuring out what your vegetation type is for your site and pulling out screenshots of your site showing that and communicating to the team. Then the species portraits, which is the more specific stuff. I did touch on that. Here are some of the details of a critical needs of frogs kind of species portrait that I've drawn up, and then how that translates into design specifications is the kind of next step. This is Vassar and Hike. This is the original reference for animal-aided design that I mentioned previously. Here we talk about sparrowbucks, lesser kestrels, and some owl boxes. Another option might be to think about bug hotels and introduce that, but try to think about specific species of bugs or insects that you might be interested in attracting. I have here a list of mutualisms for plants and pollinators. There's a few projects to try and enhance stepping stones for sunbirds, which like tubular red and orange plants, for example. And then you can start to develop a database of what the different needs are as a tool, as a reference tool for yourself as we are becoming more mature in our animal-aided design skill set as an industry. So this is a good start. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand the baton over to Francois Cilliers, who is going to tell you about some community work and community stewardship that is just amazing. The work that they're doing in Durbanville is incredible. One of the reasons I thought it was important to highlight this is that stewardship is a component of version 2 of Green Star as well. So this shows you the potential of what communities can be doing for biodiversity. So over to you, Francois.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for this opportunity. And just to reiterate that I'm presenting on behalf of the Wildflower Stepping Stone project, which is a project on the urban edge in the northern areas of Cape Town. These blue pins are some of the stepping stones that I'll be telling you about. But you can see here we have the urban development. Here we have the Tygerberg Nature Reserve down at the bottom of the slide. And you can see we're right at the urban edge here. So what is the Stepping Stone project? As I say, it's in the northern suburbs of Cape Town, specifically the Tygerberg area, and we comprise 8 neighborhoods, 15 parks. We've got 2 major river corridors in our area, as well as 2 road verges that we work on. And I think Peta mentioned in passing the importance of road verges even as an urban ecological environment. So what are these stepping stones that we're talking about? Well, islands of locally indigenous wildflowers that are found in a park or road verge that we permanently protect from mowing. And you can see an example in the photograph of an area that we're protecting here with logs, and also garden areas created in public open spaces to showcase this locally indigenous vegetation. And I'll be showing you 2 examples of that a little bit later. And just to say that it's not only about the stepping stones, we also work, as I said, on river corridors. And you can see from this aerial photograph that we are very richly endowed with water resources in our area. And we have a major wetlands area, as well as various artificial wetlands in the form of dams in the area. So what we've achieved so far is the protection of about 20 stepping stones, and each of those typically has about 20 to 30 species. The plant distribution is highly localized. So you can see from this photograph, there's a particular distribution of bulbs in this area, and we find that each stepping stone is quite distinctive in the mix of vegetation that is in the area, even stepping stones as close as 500 meters from each other. And once we start working on these stepping stones, we see that there's typically rapid regrowth after the first year. And again, I'll show you later some examples of areas that we've protected. And one of the other activities we're busy with is building a database of species in our stepping stones. And just in our area, we've already recorded 161 different plant species. So who are we? Well, we're a bunch of volunteer residents, and I'd like to acknowledge Anel and Delena, who are also on the call. We're concerned with biodiversity in our area, and we are a core group of us, 6 of us, who are really driving the project, and then various community subgroups who support this project in their respective areas. So what we're trying to do is to conserve existing remnants of this critically endangered locally indigenous vegetation, and in doing so, create habitat for the local fauna and flora. So here you can see examples of the dwarf chameleon that Peta was talking about, and insects, various pollinators that inhabit the areas, and creating a habitat that hopefully restores birds as well as creating ecological corridors for wildlife. So in that diagram that you saw, the corridors for wildlife to safely be able to traverse our areas from one area of habitat to the next. Our approach is micro-conservation, which is not a solution, but it's an improvement on what things currently are. And that is in contrast, for example, to the very large-scale projects like the Overberg Renosterveld Conservation Trust, which is developing extensive areas in the Overberg, an absolutely amazing project. So what our aims are to create interesting recreational and educational spaces for our communities, getting people involved, interested. And these are proving to be outdoor classrooms for local schools, ECD centers, and some of our members are working to link the activities in the stepping stones with curriculum outcomes. We're also trying to raise awareness in our areas of the importance of urban biodiversity. And I can just tell you that there's interest on one of our neighborhood groups in the webinar. There's been a bit of chat going on in the background and excitement about it. So we feel that we're starting to make a difference. These are some quotes from school children in our areas to emails that you can see here from students that they sent after a presentation. I think it was at the Kenridge Primary School. And I just love this one. We had some volunteers working in a park weeding, getting rid of all the invasives. And a local child came running up and said, "You can't take that out. Those are special plants." So we like to think that about 2 years in, we really are already starting to see a difference both in attitudes and in the spaces that we're creating. So why do we do this? Well, our neighborhoods are home to 2 critically endangered vegetation types. On the one hand, we've got the Swartland shale Renosterveld. Renosterveld is a critically endangered part of the Cape Floral Kingdom. And you can see from the graph that around 95% of Renosterveld from the west coast through the Cape Peninsula across to the Overberg has been destroyed. And only about 5% of what used to be around still exists, and only 1% of that is still being actively conserved. Apart from the Renosterveld, we also have the Cape Flat Sand fynbos in our area. So we're trying to counter destruction, we're trying to counter fragmentation, create those stepping stones for the insects, for the birds, for the other animals in the area. But the natural heritage in our urban matrix is irreplaceable. Renosterveld occurs nowhere else in the world. And it's being threatened dramatically by agricultural expansion, urban expansion, as well as inappropriate management policies within the city. So we're trying to counter that destruction and fragmentation, and in so doing, promote a climate resilient Cape Town, but also contribute to the United Nations decade of eco-restoration that we are currently in. So what we do, as I've said, is the stepping stones, Renosterveld gardens, working on wetlands and river corridors, but there's also a whole lot of enabling work that we do where we capacitate and support community groups. We undertake community activities, school activities. You heard from Peta what an incredible resource iNaturalist is. So we document fauna and flora on iNaturalist. We do fundraising and also ultimately are trying to work to change this policy with the City of Cape Town. So a little bit about the stepping stones. What we typically do is we'll choose an area that has a high density of locally indigenous vegetation. And what we do is we look for areas where residents and homeowner associations are committed to assist. And you can see that we get people involved, but we also get formal permission. We engage with recreation and parks, we submit written proposals, and Anel, for example, is in the process of updating our information with the city about the various stepping stones, which she does on a regular basis. We undertake wildflower walks with residents to get them interested in what is on their doorstep. We make presentations to the homeowner associations, and then, as I say, we support these community subgroups to take ownership of stepping stones. We need to help them to understand what is Renosterveld, what is weeds, and get them involved in keeping the upkeep of the areas. And we also undertake environmental education via the social media. And we found that this is a key part of getting both the acceptance of residents who may not want to be actively involved and the engagement of those who do. We then demarcate areas in aesthetically pleasing ways, and we are slowly in the process of developing signage. This is about version 4 or 5 of our signage that we put up. You can see that we have species boards with QR codes, the QR codes about the Renosterveld more generally. We've actually just hosted a group of overseas artists who were interested in our project, and they were going to be working on signage like this. And then once we've identified and demarcated the areas, volunteers move in and remove litter and rubbish. And we undertake 3 different kinds of restoration in the area. So I'll tell you a little bit about each of those approaches. So in terms of our passive restoration, what we're doing is removing invasive shrubs and weeds. So on the right-hand side here, you can see an area where the weeds have all been removed. And this might look a little bit barren, but I'll show you something in a moment that you'll understand why we get excited about this. Here we have an area outside the stepping stone where we have the invasive Patterson's curse, and you can see how it overruns the complete area. We get rid of invasive shrubs like Port Jackson, and the wild oats is an incredible problem. And you can see here, this was one of our little campaigns trying to make neighbors aware in the community of how a bigger problem it is with seeding. So here are 3 views of different stepping stones in our area. And you can see that after even a short period of passive restoration, what amazing scenes there are for residents in the stepping stones. In terms of active restoration, what we do is we identify plant species that can be actively restored. And as Peter was saying, for fynbos, for example, you have to undertake propagation by cuttings because you can't disturb the roots. So we're slowly learning which species are and aren't suitable for active restoration. But you can see here one of the parks in our area where within a 4-year period, there's this dramatic change in the area. So we aim for areas that are both ecological, but also aesthetically pleasing for the neighborhoods that they're in. We also undertake rescue and restoration projects, but there have been 3 examples. Jip de Jager Drive is a major expansion of a road through our area. We had people moving in on the Krippelboom Dam to weed and mow, and the Riesling Dam as well. And these are plants that volunteers went in and rescued, but these are literally sitting in people's backyards. And this is not sustainable or efficient. And ultimately, we would love to have a rescue nursery where we can rescue these plants, but properly look after them and then use them to distribute across our various areas. Moving on to Renosterveld Gardens, these are being created to showcase locally indigenous vegetation. So the one garden is the Magic Forest Garden, which is in our area. And this is literally, this plan was drawn, I think, about a year, 18 months ago. And a few weeks ago, the project got to the point where some of the hard landscaping had been completed and the restoration of plants began. And then this is a project in one of our local parks, which Delena, who's on the call, has fabulous artistic skills. So she's designed this, and they are slowly busy developing that garden. In terms of wetlands and rivers, this is a somewhat newer activity in the whole group. As I said, we've got 2 river corridors and a major wetland in our area, and this is somewhat earlier days in terms of development than the stepping stones that we are working on. But ANEL has, for example, established active collaborations with the Tygerberg Wetlands Association, and so this was a cleanup that we held literally last weekend. So you can see how we get the community involved. We use social media to advertise activities, get people involved, and we had 14 bags of rubbish that we managed to pull out of the wetlands as part of that restoration process. And we've also had a collaboration with the Tygerberg Nature Reserve, who've donated plants for restoration in this particular wetland area. In terms of the enabling work that we do, there's a whole range. So we've had Mandela Day activities over the last couple of years, getting people involved, increasing awareness. But we're now moving to bulb planting workshops, for example, where we get the community involved in planting and caring for bulbs that are going to, after a year or two, be plants that we can use as part of our active restoration efforts in the stepping stones. We also work with schools. We've got 3 collaborations with 3 schools, and we've had various projects over the course of the last year, again, thanks to active collaboration and networking with those schools by members of the core team. This project has resulted in multiple collaborations. So Peta has been really helpful in terms of guidance with some aspects of this project. We've also worked with conservationists, freshwater scientists, restoration horticulturalists, recreation and parks ecological coordinators. So again, that trying to make these linkages with the formal structures. Other conservation organizations, as I've said, 2 I haven't mentioned yet is Fynbos Life and the Bristle Restoration Nursery, the various homeowners associations that we have connections with. In Welgemoot in particular, they have a city improvement district project that is funded and really contributing amazingly to the work in that community, the local residents and schools, as I've said. So other work that we do is documenting the fauna and flora, as I've mentioned on INAT, really trying hard to change City of Cape Town policy. We're all enthusiasts, so we live in hope. And doing funding proposals to get funding because the project is growing quite rapidly. But it's not without its challenges. One of the biggest issues that we have is countering historical approaches to managing urban spaces by the city and managing fragmentation across City of Cape Town departments. You know, we have these agreements with recreation and parks about what areas need to be protected. And the next thing we find stormwater moving in with a huge great tractor and destroying attractive habitat that we've managed to restore. And there's a constant battle against invasives, shrubs like trees like poplars, shrubs like the Port Jackson, and various plants like kikuyu, Patterson's curse, plantago, burr clover, wild oats that are massive problems in our areas. But we're slowly winning, and this is a picture of one of the dams in our area, and you can see the amazing results of the work of the project that is ultimately of benefit to the community and also to the habitat. So that's me. And as I say, on behalf of the Wildflower Stepping Stones project, and if you want to know more, you can use those QR codes to our Instagram feed and our Facebook page. And there's our email address if you'd like to get in touch. So I'll just leave that up for another second or two if people want to scan those, but I believe the recording will also be available. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you so much. And yeah, we will open up for questions now. You can feel free to raise your hand or just pop it in the question box. I'll go ahead and start. One of the questions I did have, this is directed to you, Peter, is there's been a strong sort of push towards a certain type of fencing that's been quite popular over the past couple of years called Clearview, and it's got, quite a small grating. How do you convince sort of developers and manufacturers of those fences about the risks of having such narrow gratings, for example? Or how do you promote the urbanization? Because as one of your strategies was to have, more gaps in the fencing and that. So.
That's a very good question. I think, to be fair, the ink is not dried yet on the version 2 standard, and which would give us a little bit more clout to be able to communicate compliance requirements. And really, that particular literature piece that coined the term animal-aided design was published in 2018. And so coming from science and translating into practices is slow. And urban ecology as a study is also still in its pioneering era, especially in translating it from natural sciences into design sciences. And so I don't know how we convince yet. And I'm hoping that the floor has some good ideas on strategies. But I think obviously the first point with all these things is awareness and understanding of the impact, that even something as small as a change in your boundary treatment can have an impact and have a lasting impact on the overall ecological connectivity. I see Francois Retief's hand is waving at us. Francois, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone, for the presentations. My question is kind of from a practical perspective on projects. Who does this? So I've got a project now, and we really want to get this kind of inclusive lens in terms of, the strategies you've applied, Peter. Is it the role of your landscape architects? Do we need specialists involved? If the role of the landscape architects, are you on a mission to educate, whose role is it to disperse this information?
Yeah.
How do you think it might play out in the industry?
Yeah. I think very much it is going to be up to the landscape architects to design it in. There needs to be a campaign to sort of build capacity there. We've already started integrating this thinking with teaching at university level. There's been kind of some of it going in some of the programs for a while, but I think getting down to this kind of design rhetoric that I've been sharing with you today is really quite novel, and framing it in this way that sort of thinks about the system of your green infrastructure and how your particular plot of land might fit into a network as part of or the matrix as a stepping stone, as it were, is quite, it's really quite cutting edge in the field. So yes, keen on, continued education, continued awareness. I hope that everyone who attended today's webinar can become advocates for urban biodiversity moving forward. And I don't think it is a huge divergent kind of, it's not super different to what we've been doing. This was the thing that really struck me, is when I got down to the nuts and bolts of it, it wasn't that hard to do. It's just being more mindful in your choices, which a lot of our sustainable and green design is, isn't it?
Great, thanks, Peter.
I don't see any other hands up. Are there other questions or thoughts? Maybe some people have some feedback or some contributions they want to make. Here is one from Wendy Ann in the comments. As part of a built environment project team, architects and designers have an opportunity to integrate requirements of animal-aided design into the landscape brief. Yes, you do. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, and I think making friends with a good ecologist is a good idea. There's a shift on both sides. So, initially when I first started asking questions of ecologists, they would say I would say, how would I design an urban building with frogs in mind? The response from Professor Alan Channing, who ended up being one of the co-supervisors of my master's, was leave a 60-meter buffer between your building, around your building. And I was like, at the time I was thinking of Central Santon and the Riverside areas with, I think the area is actually called Riverside. And a 60-meter buffer is just not practical at all. And so that's why I went and did that master's to try and understand, okay, on a small scale, in an urban environment, in an integrated way, is there potential and opportunity to be more supportive of those animals that can kind of coexist in urban environments if we were to consciously make it a little bit more supportive of their movement and of their kind of habitat needs? And the answer from my first scan of the literature was a resounding yes. And so that was really encouraging. And of course, the next kind of thing is around social acceptance, which is a lot of what the Wildflower Stepping Stones is working on. But they're also, like, people are terrified of snakes, and a lot of people really don't like frogs. So there's that kind of aspect that we have to be aware of as well and take into consideration, in sometimes being mindful of how you create degrees of separation, which might also be like that notion of public to private space. You have flows from one to the other within your design of a house. You have that same kind of flow. So there's kind of, you can think about degrees of wildness in your landscaping and in how you bring people and nature together as well. I've seen a few opportunities for that kind of thinking, especially if you have a little bit more space and a bigger site.
And that was going to be one of my questions as well, is how do you like delineate between the type of species you want to come through and the type of ones that you not necessarily want to come onto the property?
Yeah, that's a bit tougher. It is a bit tougher. Yeah, I mean, managing conflict is a whole science in and of itself. It's maybe a separate webinar to think about. But yes, it is one of concern and consideration. But I will say that there's a lot of work that can be done on the social side around preferences and perceptions, which I've seen a huge amount of work from entomologists, especially people who are sort of spider efficient, affiliates. On social media, doing things like making cartoons of jumping spiders, which are the cute spiders, as it were, and spreading information about how dangerous they really are. In reality, not dangerous at all for 99.99999 species. And then there's an element of caution, but we live with spiders in our space all the time, every day. And you generally don't get bitten. So there's also that kind of thing to and when you do, it's not fatal. The fatalities, or you don't lose arms or that kind of thing. So I guess that the take home is also that a lot of the animals in our space might not be as dangerous as we think they are, usually aren't, and are definitely more scared of us than we are of them. So they move away from us, right? So there is also, that's one of the things that I think we've kind of lost a little bit as we become more urbanized, is just the good sense of how to engage with nature to avoid conflict, because we have that extinction of experience. So there's a question from Malus: are there similar organizations like Stepping Stones in other parts of the country? Yes. There are, I don't know, Francois, if you know of other organizations, but I'm not super aware of what there is in Gauteng, but they do have an Adopt a Spot program. Francois, do you want to comment?
So I don't actually, but I'm just wondering if Anel or Delena, who are also on the call, might be aware of similar projects elsewhere. Yeah. Just by the way, in terms of conflict, we happen to have a psychologist on our core team who helps manage conflict with people around us. So yeah, Anel, Delena, I don't know whether you perhaps know of other projects elsewhere.
There's 2 more questions. There's quite a lot of questions coming through on the comments now. I see conservancies in eThekwini do great work in conserving natural spaces in KwaZulu-Natal, indigenous seed saving and plant nurseries, etc. That's fantastic to hear, Sarah. Peter, do you have experience working with municipalities to increase biodiversity in public parks? Yes, but it's tricky to approach them. But yeah, there's quite a lot. I mean, a lot of it has come from a groundswell of people saying we want to adopt our public park and start taking care of it as a neighborhood. So there's a policy of responding to kind of public sentiment. So there is very much this thing of political will that needs to be demonstrated. A lot of what's happened in Cape Town is city will work with residents who go and get like a sign up from their neighbors. So you literally, a lot of the work that Wildflower Stepping Stones has been doing is going door to door and getting their neighbors to sign up and sign consent and say, we want to have a biodiversity area in our park. And they've also adopted one of the outputs from my PhD in the mowing suspension time period so that they can protect the seeds that are dispersing as well as the flowers when they stop mowing in particular areas of biodiversity. Rudolf Bitzer says, I think the challenge for architects are how to keep buildings clean and pristine, while designing for bird boxes, insect hotels, etc. Frogs can make a very loud noise, and it becomes a problem in residential areas. Is there strategies available to you to mitigate these problems? Good question, because what if you have raucous toads that sound like quacking ducks going from 9 o'clock until 1 a.m., right? Outside your window, that's not a lot of fun. Does anybody else maybe know of other stewardship groups across the country? The Botanical Society is a national network, and my colleague Rupert Quirkman probably will have the best sense of which stewardship groups are active where and what they're doing, because he was a conservation manager. He's resigned from Botsok, but for many years was a key kind of central network person.
So, Peter, just to say that Nell messaged me to say that she isn't aware of any other similar projects to the Wildflower Stepping Stones.
Yeah, so Hartfield Village Parks is on a smaller scale. They've got 3 or 4 gardens. There's Friends of Rondebosch Common, obviously Friends of Meadowridge Common, Friends of Liesbeek, Elsie's Cloud Renewal Project, but these are all in Cape Town. So I'm not sure nationally what's happening.
Cool, thanks. If there's any other questions. One of my questions was what are sort of the policies that we do want to change in the city of Cape Town and I guess nationally as well. But are there any specific policies that we're looking to?
Yeah, we've been thinking about being strategic about how we approach this. So I surveyed about 142 parks in Cape Town, and I would say that the vast majority of them, maybe 90%, I don't have the exact numbers, literally had only like 3 or 4 kind of weeds that grow in the grass coming up. And then there was a group that had these special bulbs that are so prevalent in the area where Francois' Wildflower Stepping Stones are active. And there you would get kind of between 4 and 10 different species per park coming up. And then you had a much smaller kind of group of spaces that had more than that had perennials, that had summer flowering species. And so it's really documenting what's coming up as the first step to understanding what's there and how we can approach it strategically. So the bulbs, they're dormant through winter. They have a particular period where they emerge, they flower, and they produce seed, and they can sort of then be benefit from a mowing suspension. The biodiversity areas with a greater richness and more species, they can start looking at restoration or biodiversity conservation areas and doing some development that sort of sets that aside or puts in those cues to care simple things that we mentioned before. And the rest, we really need to be managing for invasive aliens, and mowing is still one of the tools in our toolkit that can address that. So I don't think it's a matter of having a blanket wide mowing suspension. The nuance, because it's very important that we still do maintain the safety of our roadsides, the security of our neighborhoods, the crime prevention through environmental design, that things look cared for, that we are addressing invasions. But we have been talking about looking at different kind of mowing suspensions and biodiversity kind of thresholds for thinking about those different treatments across the country, because in different ecosystems, that strategy might look a little different. For example, in a summer rainfall area, it might look a bit different. In a grassland ecosystem, it might look a little different. So yeah, really important. I cannot stress enough how important it is for people to get out onto iNaturalist and document, so that we can get a sense of what is actually present in our cities as a starting point. And then that gives us the evidence to be able to shift policy in a unequivocal way that sort of says to people, right, we hear that there's people who have different views on us, who have different value systems, but this evidence is indisputable that this is a valuable site for biodiversity. And then similarly, where we have people who are very concerned and very well-meaning, who start saying we should suspend mowing altogether in areas that only have like maybe one little species of flower coming up. And then we're like, well, maybe we can transplant like 5 individuals of one species and into a safe bed on the side. So I think there's a mix of different things that we can do, but the more that we engage with it, the more the nuance of what those policies might look like might come into play.
Cool. Thank you so much. And just a little comment from Marluce as well. She said that Friends of the Wilds is doing well in Joburg, restoring public parks as well. So
glad to hear that.
I'm just going to close up quickly. Our next webinar will be next month in August on the topic of tiny houses, which I think a lot of people are interested in. So please join us for that. And then September will be on the circular economy as well. And again, just a reminder that if you have any specific topics, potential speakers or sponsors, please fill out the form or get in touch with any of us from the Regenerative Collaborative, and you could possibly win 500 Rand. A great big thank you to our speakers, Dr. Brom and Prof. Cilliers. Very interesting topics, and I think we all got a lot from it, so really appreciate it. And if you know of any sponsors, or if you'd like to sponsor for the CPD points for these webinars, please reach out to us as well. We really look forward to it. And just a big thank you to today's sponsor, which was SIAD, or the South African Institute of Drafting. Please follow us on LinkedIn and Eventbrite for all future events. And thank you for attending, everyone. And we look forward to
we've got a hand up from Marluce. Do you want to say something, Marluce?
I think she put both hands up because it was such a great webinar.
Thanks.
And yeah, thank you, everyone. And again, thank you to our speakers. Really appreciate it. And see you next month.